There's an awful lot of talk about immigration. Awful lot of talk about it. I want to try to put a slightly different spin on it from what we usually hear in the news. The Hebrew Bible is based on the assumption, when I say the Hebrew Bible, I mean virtually the entire corpus of the biblical texts, and then going on into the Talmud, is based on the assumption that there is such a thing as a nation, that there is such a thing as a people. God creates the nations in Genesis, and from there to the end of time, as far as we know, there are going to be nations. This is, the Bible is it's not a John Lennon, imagine there's no countries, no peoples, no religions, we'll all just become sort of this paste of people listening to early 70s pop music. No. There are nations because the truth is complicated. And every nation has its own mission. Every nation has its own contribution. Every nation has its own strengths and its weaknesses. Every nation has something to contribute. And the vision, the Jewish vision, the ultimate vision for peace on earth that we find in the prophets of Israel, that's a vision in which the nations remain. They don't disappear. They don't turn into one thing. There is no one thing human beings are supposed to be. Isaiah teaches us that Egypt, that in the coming time, that Egypt is going to worship together with Assyria and Assyria together with Israel. But Egypt is still going to be Egypt. They'll have their own traditions, their own customs, and their own ideas. And Assyria will be the same. The difference between this age and that age is that they will make peace with us, and they will cease to persecute us. And to the extent that we're persecuting them, we'll stop that too in exchange. And there'll be peace in the world among different nations, not some kind of universal, everybody's the same, but the opposite. Everybody's different, and we'll have peace even though everybody's different. When one day we rebuild that temple on Har Bayit, on the Temple Mount, it's going to be because we've made peace with our Muslim Arab neighbors. We'll have made peace with them in such a way that it'll be possible to build that thing there without causing hatred between us. And then it will become, according to our vision, the capstone of where all the nations of the world will come and celebrate together. But you can't celebrate together if there aren't nations. Now, why do I say this? Because the idea of a nation as a political ideal is only a biblical ideal. It does not, you can't find it in Greek sources, and you can't find it in Roman sources. Roman sources are interested in imperial things, and Greek sources are interested in the city-state. You don't get to the nation in Western political theory outside of the Jewish tradition until you get to Polybius. We're talking about many, many centuries after the Bible. There's no Western ideal of the nation independent of the place where it's found, and that's the Bible. Where do you find it? You find it in Deuteronomy. You find it where God says, you're only going to have a king from your own people. You're only going to have a prophet from your own people. You're going to have borders. You think the borders that Israel gets in Deuteronomy are big. But you know what God thinks? God thinks, heck, I'm the first God in the history of the human race to give borders to his own people so that they don't go out and try to conquer the world, because that's evil. And the Western idea of the nation state that is a cornerstone of modernity, that the Irish get their own country, that the Poles get their own country, that the British do not have to be ruled by the Spanish. That's a biblical idea. It's not a biblical idea that they didn't know was biblical. It's an idea that comes to the fore only when they start reading the Bible in their own languages, and they say, wow, this is an incredibly good idea. How about if we have self-determination and rule ourselves? That way we can be free as a nation. The only source of this is in the Jewish Bible. It's a gift that the Jewish Bible gives to the world. And today, when I see, the German chancellor, and she says 1.5 million Middle Easterners entering this year into my country, no problem. I think she needs to read her Bible. Okay, because Of course nations are supposed to help each other, right? We're supposed to be a light to the nations. But a light to the nations doesn't mean that you drown your own country with some other nation until you're extinguished. I apologize if I'm hurting somebody's feelings, but I think we really have to talk about this. Any country that has something to offer, something moral, something good, a culture of its own that's worth sharing with the world, is a country that's worth defending against being swamped by the other countries, the other nations that it's trying to help. If that's not obvious, then, like I say, I think we just need to go back to the Bible. Our topic this evening is kind of Western civilization, all of it. How's it doing? And maybe we'll have a little bit of a debate. I'm going to take the side that it's not doing so great. The reason that I say this is that I understand the West to have been built on the Bible, and I'm sure that my colleagues will come and say, "Well, Yoram, you know that the West was built on the Bible and on Plato and Aristotle and what came after that." And I'd actually like to, just in order to be provocative and make the evening more interesting for those of you who, came all this way, to say that actually no, although I know plenty about the contributions of Plato and Aristotle, but what we consider to be the West is that world which also not only had Plato and Aristotle, but had to have as the pillars of it built by the Bible, and especially by the Hebrew Bible, by the Old Testament. We have, for example, the Islamic world, which had plenty of Plato and Aristotle. There's a tremendous amount of study of Plato and Aristotle in the Islamic world, but the Islamic world did not have the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And the divergence between the West and the Middle East is to a significant degree that. Now, I'll give you a couple of points to back this up, but I want to rush to the end of what it is that I'm going to propose so that you're not guessing. The West was created by the Bible to a very, very significant degree, essentially so. And if you were to take the Bible out of the West, then the West would not only, I believe, cease to be the West, which, so what? It could be something nicer than the West. Who cares? But I also believe that it would not survive the ordeal. I believe that if you remove the Bible from the West, you basically have residual fumes from spirits of the Bible hanging out. And as soon as those are used up, as soon as those are dissipated, then you will not have a West. I want to give you a couple of examples of what it is that I'm talking about. But first, let's talk about that other crucial component of the West, which is liberalism. Liberalism, the belief that that society best orders itself, and I believe this too. Society best orders itself when it concerns itself with, first of all, with the liberty of the individuals who live in the society. Second, that there be equality before the law and equality of fundamental opportunity for the people living in the society. All right, those are liberal values. I hold those values, but I don't think those values are remotely enough in order to be able to sustain a society. Let's just consider a couple of examples. We have in the Western world today an unprecedented crisis of birth rates, of childbirth, child rearing. Sometimes it's called the crisis of the family. There's other components of the crisis of the family, but for the moment, let's just talk about this one biblical concept, one Old Testament Hebrew Bible concept. Pour vous, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and conquer it and subdue it, is the first commandment of the Jewish Bible. To the extent that Christians take the Jewish Bible seriously as part of the Christian Bible, and very frequently it has been taken extremely seriously, then that becomes a commandment also for Christians. And that's a commandment which expresses God's joy in our multiplying. Somebody could say, what does God care if we multiply? He should care about the quality of the content of our character, not the number of our children. But the Jewish God cares about the number of our children, because he thinks that health and well-being and flourishing and fulfillment depend on each and every one of us trying to do our best to have children, and not just one child or 1.5 children or whatever's in the vogue now, but many children to flourish, to multiply. And so long as a society believes in its future, then it invests in having children. Now, today we have the most liberal societies that have ever existed, thank God. Wealthiest, healthiest in many ways. But they don't want to have children. In Israel, we are having children. Israel, the average Jewish woman in Israel has 3 children, and it's going up every year. For 10 years, it's been going up. I'm very proud of that. But the entire rest of the Western world is not producing enough children to be able to reproduce itself. That is, if you go to a country like Holland or like Germany, England, France, Italy, none of these countries are countries that produce enough children so that they will be able to maintain themselves going into the future. What does that mean? What's happening there? Well, we know roughly what's happening. What's happening is that people feel free, people feel equal. We've achieved that. They're free, they're equal. They're the freest, most equal people they've ever been. But they've lost any sort of sense of what it means to have responsibility for the future of their nations, of their religions, of their traditions, of the good in the world. Yes, the good, I said the good. That is, there are some societies and some movements and some intellectual ideas and some political movements that are not good. That you may have noticed there are some things in the world that are just not good. And if you want to fight the things that are not good and do good in the world, we call that the covenant between God and the Jewish people, the covenant between God and all nations that follow in alliance with the Jewish people. That covenant is based on the assumption that we're here in the world to give God a hand and do some good. And God says to us, well, how are you going to do any good if there aren't any of you? If you're disappearing? You're not going to do any good. Get out there, get married, have kids, and then do some good. You think you can do good without that? Now, this is a very, very simple clash between the modern West, which thinks that you're okay if you are, fulfilling yourself, and a biblical-based civilization which says you're not okay unless you're doing something in order to make this world something decent and worth living in, not just today, not just by carrying the groceries for the woman across the street or putting on tefillin, but for the next generation and the next and the next. So I've just given you 2 examples, and our time is short, so I'll stop here. But my conclusion is pretty simple. We're the freest and most equal peoples who've ever lived, and it's great. And if we don't have the Bible, then we lose our compass. We don't have families. We don't have nations. We don't have anything other than people who are free. And the answer to the question, free to do what? Well, I don't think there's any answer to that once you've eliminated all the other values.
For all of the mistakes and excesses of nationalist governments that we can point to, empire's far worse. Nationalism used to be kind of a progressive, popular kind of, if you're a well-meaning person, then you supported nationalism. After World War II, that kind of changed, and today, to say that you're nationalist is almost like saying that you're a racist. In today's world, nationalism is rapidly becoming relevant again with the British vote for independence, and with Donald Trump having put certain nationalist issues center stage in his campaign. And whether or not these particular developments end up having some kind of permanence, I think it's clear that the issues that are being raised of whether national independence and the national state should continue to be the basis for the political order, those issues are not going away. I think they're simply going to continue to become more and more relevant. Now, as we know, most of Western history has actually been dominated by this imperialist aspiration. Most of it. The imperial dream was the Roman dream, among others. And when Christianity took over the Roman Empire and became the official church, the idea of a Pax Romana, of a Roman law that would extend to every nation that could be reached in order to bring peace to the world, a Roman peace, that becomes a Christian dream, a Catholic dream. And for more than 1,000 years, Europe was governed, at least by this idea. I'm not saying that it was always executed. Often it wasn't. But the dream was there, and often it was applied. The popes often allied successfully, or more so or less so, with the German Holy Roman emperors. They sought to create a universal Christian kingdom. And the Hebrew Bible never ever stopped causing trouble for this dream of universal Christian empire. So peoples, the French, the English, the Czechs, the Poles, long before the Reformation, we have cases of the formation of nations that were inspired by the Old Testament. French Catholicism modeled itself on the idea of the Davidic dynasty, that the French were the heirs to the Davidic kingdom. And so there always was, even within this Catholic universalism, a tendency towards nationalism, which entered through the Jewish Bible, through the Old Testament. When Protestantism comes around, it becomes central. The Protestants, first of all, they want the right to read the Bible their own way. But that's not just a religious doctrinal matter, it's a national matter. Because what it means is that different nationalities, different groups and traditions are demanding the right to read the Bible their own way. And reading the Bible your own way means the right to have your own constitution, the right to have your own self-government. The two things are directly tied. So the modern period is really born with the Protestants returning to the Hebrew Bible and to the national model of the Kingdom of Israel, which is an independent national state. This was the model on which the modern West was based. We can say that our freedoms are based on it. For people who think this was invented in America, read the Dutch Declaration of Independence from 1581. You'll wonder what happened to copyright laws. I mean, it's so similar, it's astonishing. But it's 200 years earlier. And the Dutch, the English, the Scottish, other peoples, they fight a war against universal Catholic empire in order to be able to determine their own constitutions, their own religions. The 30 Years' War is a war about what's the character of the international order. Will it be an imperial order with a single empire? Or will it allow freedom of peoples? Will peoples be able to be free? And so you have the French, who are Catholics, and the Dutch, who are Calvinists, and the Swedes, who are Lutherans, fighting against German and Spanish troops in order to create nations. That's the 30 Years' War. And Westphalia, the famous Peace of Westphalia, it creates a new order in Europe. I'll call it the Protestant construction of Europe. And what this does is it takes the principle of self-determination, which is drawn from the Old Testament, it's drawn from the political thought of the Dutch and of the English and of the Scots, and it reconstructs Europe along the lines of, from now on there's going to be national freedom. Peoples will be able to determine for themselves what church we're going to have, what religion we're going to have, what constitution we're going to have, who's going to govern us. Will we be a republic? Will we be a kingdom? That's what independence means. That's what American independence is. That's what independence means. When we celebrate Independence Day in America or in Israel or in elsewhere, independence means that there's such a thing as a people, and that one people may be different from another, and that it's a decent human thing to do, that it's the right thing to do, that it's something God wants us to do, to allow peoples to be free, to be able to set their own course, make their own mistakes. And maybe they'll do the right thing. And then if they're successful, then we can imitate them. You might have heard the word diversity. And diversity wasn't invented by today's political correctness mongers. Diversity was invented by the Protestant construction based on a biblical model, that the nations should be diverse because that's what God wants to see, mankind flourishing in diversity. Now, it's been, I don't know, we had about 350 years that the order of the West was built on this model. I don't pretend that it was ideal. What could be ideal? What human construct is ideal? There are many things that these European nation states did that I'm not interested in endorsing. They were real good at talking about self-determination in Europe, but when it came to, to Africa or Asia or the Americas, they didn't have a problem being colonialists and imperialists there. And you know what? For the Jews, it wasn't such hot shakes either. At the same time, I think that we have to be realistic. There never was a more tolerant order of nations than the order that was created on the basis of this Protestant construction that allowed each nation its own fate. There never was something that sparked an age like the modern age in which the free competition of nations in political theory and in theology and in science and in the arts created the world that we live in. Now, it's possible for that competition, for that rivalry, for that self-determination of each people, it's possible for that to disappear. We take it for granted. We think it's just some kind of natural thing, but the truth is mankind almost never had it in history. Almost never had it in history. And when we look at enterprises that are considered to be progressive and liberal today, I have in mind the European Union, whose leadership wants to erase the boundaries between nations, or international law, which is almost synonymous with goodness and light, unless you happen to be a nation like America or Israel that is outside of the consensus of what the international lawyers think ought to be happening, and then it starts to become a little bit oppressive. The United Nations, free immigration of peoples, free trade, it all sounds so good, and in some cases it's terrific. Some of these things have done great things, have done good things. But we should be careful. We need to be careful. We need to understand. The old Protestant construction, for 70 years, since World War II, it's been dying as a reaction to World War II and World War I, for good reasons and for bad reasons. That's the reality. The Protestant construction has been dying from the world. And what's replacing it is something we can call the liberal construction. And the liberal construction of the West is not something that exists yet. It's still a theory. But this theory says really there's only one principle on which political legitimacy is based, and that's individual freedom. And again, it's something that sounds beautiful. It sounds beautiful. What could be more wonderful than that the entire world should be based on individual freedom? But it turns out that when people keep reading and rereading and rereading the classics of liberal thought, and they think about, as let's say John Locke did, they reduce human beings to everybody is perfectly free and everybody's perfectly equal and everyone makes decisions on the basis of consent and government is only on the basis of consent. That's all beautiful. And Locke, by the way, he thought that he was just expounding Protestant principles. He didn't even know that he was doing something special. But today, hundreds of years later, when these principles, these beautiful principles, are taken, and they're taken and used as a weapon, time and time again, they're used as a weapon by liberals, liberals who say, look, how could you possibly, United States, how could you not be willing for your soldiers to be tried by the International Criminal Court? Liberalism says you must. Or the Jews were now told in various places in Europe again and again, how can you circumcise your children? It violates human freedoms. Or Christians who want to try to raise their children, to send them to schools or to run businesses according to the way that they understand the plain meaning of Scripture. And people say, don't you understand? You're violating liberalism. You're violating human rights. And the more this goes on, and now the Brits, you want to be independent? Don't you understand how you're endangering mankind? So in the name of good Lockean principles, Well, it turns out that you can create an intolerant imperial mindset in which every one of us, Jews and Christians, British, Israelis, Americans, everyone is going to have to agree to a certain interpretation, the universal interpretation, whatever it is that is determined by international law, by the international courts. Now, I understand fully, I sympathize with my liberal friends. I understand that liberals do not understand that the advancing liberal construction is a form of imperialism. I understand that they don't get it. But when they say that a nation, the British, one of the oldest and finest nations that there are in terms of the contributions that it's made to political freedom, among other things, when the British say we've had enough and we don't consider Europe to be freedom and we would like our independence now, well, they respond, how do you say these days? In a deplorable fashion. They respond, this is unjust, this is intolerable, this is endangering the world, this is illegitimate. And did you notice how they kept saying it was illegitimate? Did you notice this? That the response, that I don't know how much you followed the press in Britain and abroad, this is illegitimate. They couldn't, I mean, it's only 52% of the vote, let's have another vote. or only the old supported it. The young were left out. What is it, the young were left out? I mean, it means that the young didn't vote. But no, but that makes it illegitimate. We have to do it again. No. England it's a parliamentary democracy. We can't make a decision on the basis of a referendum. It's not as though the people are sovereign or something. The parliament will have to decide. And people were calling for, we can find a way to negotiate our way out of this. I couldn't believe it. It was wall to wall. Everyone had some scheme for how you could make sure that this illegitimate vote was suppressed. Millions upon millions of people voting in a democratic process, but self-determination is just not a value anymore because liberalism is more important, and liberalism knows best. Now, I understand we're just at the beginning of this. It just doesn't look so horrible yet. But pay attention to this. Watch it carefully. Watch the way this outrage, people talk about, these shaming campaigns on the campuses, the political correctness. Everybody's always writing about the campuses, how awful it is. You say the wrong thing and then everybody piles on you. Hundreds, thousands of people throw things at you. But it's not, pay careful attention to this. It's not the campuses anymore. The entire Western world is one big campus now. If a nation does the wrong thing, if a religion believes the wrong thing, if a person says the wrong thing, then there's a firing squad of thousands of people who are ready to oppress and suppress you and call you out and shame you. And I hope you all understand that this is reality now in this American election. I have friends, I hope you're not offended by this. I have friends, I actually do, real, actual flesh and blood people who they're planning on voting for Donald Trump, but they don't dare to tell anybody on Facebook because they don't want to face the firing squad. And then people and then the journalists, all these journalists on the left and the right saying, well, there's no educated person who's come out in support of Trump. Well, it's true, but they're all underground. Now think about this. Think about where we've come to. Think about where we've reached and think about where we're going. Now, I don't say that, that Donald Trump doesn't deserve much of the criticism. But if your democracy doesn't allow anybody, I mean, you'll be pilloried, you'll be shamed, you'll be driven out of polite society if you support one of the two main parties. I hope you understand that your democracy is dead. If you can't support one of the two main parties in a democracy, then you don't have free elections anymore. All right, this could get very, very bad. And the further the liberal construction advances, eliminating the idea of self-determination, national self-determination, which is the principle of tolerance of other dissenting, very different views, the further we advance towards eliminating the principle that Catholics will live in the same political international order with Protestants and monarchists with Republicans and free countries with less free countries. The further we advance, the further we advance towards an imperial tyranny of the kind that history has known. It sounds far-fetched, but pay attention to it. Do me a favor, do yourself a favor. Just notice how step by step, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom to express your opinion, notice how you yourself are ever more careful not to say what you think. It's happening to you. I know it is, because it's happening to me, and it's happening to my friends. I know it's happening to you as well. Maybe not on the same subjects, we don't agree on everything, but it's happening to you. You think twice, you think 3 times. Do you want to live in a society like this? Now, I think that this is what's at issue. I think this is what's at issue. If we can't say 3 cheers for Britain, good luck with their independence, we feel for them. Just like we feel for the Kurds. We want to see Kurdish independence. We want to see Jewish independence in Israel. We want to see America independent. If we don't have the right to say that, I think we're lost. I think we're lost. So what we're talking about is a battle over the order, the nature of the civilization we live in. This is probably the most dramatic time that there has been since the Second World War. A battle over the fundamental order of the political world that we live in. Thank you all for listening. As the West, which was founded on the Bible, moves away from its commitment to biblical principles, to a moral minimum based on the Ten Commandments, to the idea of national independence and self-determination, as the West moves away from these things, I think that people will be surprised to see how quickly tyranny returns. Empire is not a tolerant form of government. And for all of the mistakes and excesses of nationalist governments that we can point to, empire is far worse. We may have forgotten that, but we'll be remembering it, unfortunately, as the move towards a universal order advances. And this is something everybody needs to think about very carefully. What's the actual source of our freedoms? Are our freedoms, as people want us to believe, are our freedoms coming, from some kind of universal commitment to individual liberty? Is that really the source? I know many people think it is, but I think the source is actually in Scripture. And if we're willing to be open-minded enough to look at the actual historical evidence and the ideas and where they come from, I think we'll see that a return to biblical principles is what we need. The State of Israel is one of the classic national states that, it's escaped the effort of the European Union to integrate it, and Israelis want to have their independence. The State of Israel is more concerned about its unique Jewish character and its ability to defend itself according to its own determinations and to make constitutional and religious decisions independently. But Israel is certainly a leading player in the question of the national state and its future. And any move, as we see in Europe, away from the national state model, among other things, it casts Israel in a light of being an illegitimate country, which I should think would be troubling, not just to Jews, but to Christians and to others. What does conservatism have to do with Judaism? Well, in justifying this nationalist position, the English and the Americans turn time and again to the Israelite national state whose history is described in the Hebrew Bible. Now, this is it's a remarkable point, but Greek and Roman antiquity produced no works, not philosophy, not literature, nothing, 0 works, as far as we know, proposing the idea of national independence of a single unified nation. Right? This is something that does not occur in the philosophy of Greece and Rome. It's unique in Western civilization in having grown out of the Hebrew Bible. Polybius, for example, the great historian, only hints at the possibility of a unified Greece. And so the independent national life of biblical Israel becomes the precedent and the model upon which French, English, Dutch, and Scottish national independence is founded. Nor is national independence the only aspect of modern political conservatism that's derived from Hebrew Scripture. And by the way, with references every once in a while, sometimes many, to the rabbinic literature as well. You know that John of Salisbury and John Fortescue root English political theory in the law of Moses in Deuteronomy. The most important conservative political theorist of the 17th century, John Selden, wrote his magnum opus as a commentary on the Talmud. He wrote his magnum opus as a commentary on the Talmud. That's pretty incredible. Who did he think was going to read it? No, seriously. Who would write such a thing, and who would read such a thing? It was in print in Europe for 150 years after he published it. And Selden's other works, like those of other conservative writers of his day, are packed with references to Jewish tradition. A typical example is the great English common lawyer and political theorist Matthew Hale, a student of Selden, who explains how all the nations of Europe based their laws on the laws of Moses. As he writes in his treatise on the nature of law, all right, now this is not some kind of like country pastor. We're talking about the greatest common lawyer of his generation, right? He's the pinnacle of learning in England at the end of the 1700s. The end of the 1600s. And he writes in his treatise on the nature of law, although God gave the Ten Commandments, quote, to a particular nation, the Jews, yet he made that nation signal and eminent and conspicuous to all the world by signs, wonders, and observable providence, that they might be like a beacon upon a hill. All right, listen to this. This great jurist and political theorist speaking to Britain, and he says the Jews are to us a beacon on the hill, that they might be like a beacon upon the hill, like a mighty and stately pillar set up in the middle of the world to hang upon it those tables of natural righteousness, which might be conspicuous and legible to the greatest part even of the Gentile world of many ages. Indeed, a careful study of this English conservative tradition, out of which later conservatives, from Burke to Alexander Hamilton, grew, reveals that it is to a remarkable degree formed in light of Jewish precedent. This is true of English political thought even before the Reformation, and it becomes even more clearly true in the 16th and 17th centuries during the struggle for an English tradition independent of Catholicism. The revolt against Catholicism brings many of these Protestant scholars to turn to Jewish tradition in order to root themselves. This means that Anglo-American conservatism is, from its birth, a sister movement of the Jewish political tradition. And in fact, it is doubtful that Anglo-American conservatism could ever have existed without this crucial Jewish source. This close kinship between Anglo-American conservatism and Jewish political theory suggests crucial lines of political alliance, both intellectual and political. Anglo-American conservatism is a tradition that Jews are especially well placed to assist in researching, updating, and promoting for consideration. Meanwhile, we Jews can draw no small measure of inspiration from seeing how Judaism became a living source for English and American political theory. I only hope that modern Israeli political thought will someday be built on the Jewish political tradition to such a degree. The same principle that allows you to say, well, why don't we divide the world and allow there to be different powers, each with its own truth. The same kind of thinking you can also see within the Mosaic Constitution, right? Beginning in the Bible. Probably a lot of people don't know that during the debates around the American founding, the single most quoted text was, by far, was the Bible. And within the quotations from the Bible, the most quoted text was Deuteronomy. Right? The reason everybody's so interested in Deuteronomy is because that's where Moses lays out his rules for how a kingdom is supposed to be. And those rules have all sorts of principles that later the Anglo-American tradition quotes over and over and over again, going back to Deuteronomy. So, for example, the separation of what we today call the separation of powers. Moses says the king's not allowed to legislate, which is this astonishing thing. And, all over the Middle East, the kings are legislating. They're like gods. The Jewish king isn't allowed to give laws. The laws are in the hands of the priests. So there's this separation between the king and the laws, which takes away a lot of the king's power. And then there's all these other restrictive laws that continue to take away the king's power, limiting his ability to tax and so on. And then this famous statement that his heart's not shouldn't rise above his brothers. All of a sudden, all the people are his brothers. So the biblical basis with regard to the Constitution starts with this principle that the person in charge of the government cannot be absolute. There's all these other players and all of these other forces which the king has to make space for. And understanding that the king has to be limited. He's not allowed to go out and conquer neighboring nations. He's not allowed to raise taxes to the heavens. He has to carry a Torah scroll around with him, so that all of these rules, their purpose is to do on the domestic front what I was describing earlier on the international front, which is to create a limited power, which comes from the recognition that the only unlimited power is God. That if you move towards any kind of an unlimited human power domestically, all you're going to do is destroy the balance among different aspects of the society.